Hello you. Yes, you. The person watching this video while having a lunch break or two fall asleep. Have you ever been punished before? Like for being a bad girl or bad boy or something like that? Well, thankfully you're not a part of today's history, because if that was the case, you're cooked. Let me tell you why. Shrew's fiddle. In medieval Germany and Austria, this punishment was also called neck violin. It was a wooden device used mainly to deal with what authorities labeled as quarrelsome or disruptive behavior, especially among women. The design was crude and humiliating. The contraption looked like a large wooden violin or a yoke and had 3 holes, 1 for the neck and 2 for the wrists. Once locked in, the person's hands were stuck directly in front of their face, leaving them completely immobilized and visibly restrained. They couldn't eat, scratch their nose, or adjust their clothing. The wrists and neck were locked tight enough that even moving slightly was uncomfortable. Most of the time, they had to stand in public places while everyone else in town walked by and stared. If they got lucky, someone just laughed. If they didn't, they got spat on, mocked, or insulted by neighbors who thought it was funny or deserved. People who ended up in this thing weren't criminals in the traditional sense. They were mostly women accused of nagging their husbands, arguing too much, or talking back to men in authority. Men weren't exempt, but most of the people forced into the device were women labeled as shrews, which was a term they used back then for any woman who talked too much, refused to obey, or didn't shut up when told. The authorities and townspeople saw it as discipline. The whole point was to make the person a warning sign. Stand there, look stupid, be quiet, and make sure nobody else in the village gets the same idea of opening their mouth when they shouldn't. Sometimes they locked 2 people into a double version of the fiddle, with the neck holes facing each other. That way, they had to stare each other in the face while being stuck in the same spot, unable to move. These were usually used on neighbors who wouldn't stop fighting, or couples who got into public arguments. They had to make peace before they were let out, which meant they either faked it or stood there until they were too tired to argue anymore. No one really cared if the problem got solved. The punishment was only about getting people to behave on the surface so the community could feel like it kept order. There was no set time limit for how long someone had to stay in the device. Some people were kept in it for a few hours, others had to stay in it all day. It depended on how the judge felt like sentencing them that day. The person wasn't allowed to sit, lie down, or relieve themselves. If they passed out, they were left there until someone decided to check. If they cried, they got mocked for that too. Ducking stool. This started out as a wooden chair, attached to a long wooden beam or lever. This whole thing was rigged so it could swing out over a pond or a riverbank. It showed up in England around the 13th century and stuck around long enough to cross over into colonial America. Local officials used it as a way to keep unruly women in line. The whole setup was usually public and theatrical. The stool was placed in the town square or by a water source where everyone could gather and watch it happen. When someone like Agnes Waterhouse got accused of witchcraft, they'd strap her into this chair like a piece of meat and haul her out over the water. Once the accused was locked into position, usually tied up to make sure she couldn't wriggle free or fight back, the crowd would gather and the lever would be pulled to dunk her underwater. The first dip was usually slow. Then it would start again, up and down. Sometimes it happened just a couple times. Other times it kept going until the woman passed out, or worse. The risk of drowning wasn't accidental, and no one in charge really cared about safety. The official excuse was always something vague about moral discipline or purging sins or testing witches, but the real point was humiliation. If someone like Elizabeth Sawyer got dunked in front of the village, it was about making sure nobody else stepped out of line. If the woman floated, she was working with the devil. If she sank, then congratulations, she was innocent right before she died. It was a method built to fail. No one got out clean. Even the ones who survived the dunking didn't come out unharmed. They'd be shunned, talked about for months, and left with nothing, while the people who ran the town went on with their day like they didn't just almost kill someone for speaking too loud or dressing the wrong way. Raphanidosis. In ancient Athens, getting caught cheating on your spouse could get you more than just public shame. It could earn you a radish up your booty. Raphanidosis was a judicial punishment used specifically on men caught in adultery, often enforced with public humiliation as the main ingredient. The law technically protected a citizen's wife from being defiled by another man, but in reality, it was less about protecting women and more about protecting the honor of the husband. If someone got caught messing around with another man's wife, the husband could take him to court and press charges under the laws governing moichia, which was the Athenian legal term for illicit caboodle with a citizen woman. Once the accusation was brought to trial and the man was found guilty, the punishment could be carried out in public, usually in front of a gathering of other citizens. This wasn't a standard court sentence, but rather more of an acceptable retaliatory act sanctioned by law and social norms. So, when Aristophanes wrote about it in his plays, it was referencing something people had actually seen or at least knew was possible. The radish wasn't some little vegetable either. It had to be big enough to hurt. It was jammed into the man's rectum, not just to cause pain, but to humiliate him in a way that stuck in everyone's memory. The whole thing was designed to emasculate the offender and turn him into a public joke. Sometimes the penalty included pulling out your hair, but not the hair on your head. Your hair down there. That was another layer of the punishment, meant to embarrass the guy even more by changing how he looked in the most degrading way they could think of. And since a lot of civic life happened naked, you can be sure the people remembered it and remembered it well. The Romans had their own way of punishing women caught cheating, though it wasn't exactly the same. One version of their response included using a mullet fish, the kind with a sharp snout and a peppery bite, forced into the woman's yahoo-hoo. Blinding. It was blinding. The art of the human centipede hasn't been thought of yet at this time. See, blinding as punishment showed up across centuries and continents, but it was in the Byzantine Empire where it turned into a politically sharpened tool. Byzantine law didn't allow anyone with a physical deformity to sit on the throne. This small detail made the punishment way more convenient than execution when it came to removing rivals. If someone posed a threat to the emperor like a rebellious general or an overambitious noble, burning or gouging out their eyes took them out of the running without turning them into a martyr. One of the most infamous cases was of Constantine VI, who was blinded by his own mother, Irene of Athens, in 797 AD. Constantine had technically been emperor since he was 10, but Irene ran the empire as regent and didn't really want to hand over the power. When Constantine finally tried to push her out, Irene had him captured and blinded so severely he died shortly after. That left her as the sole ruler of Byzantium, and the first woman to rule it in her own name. This method stuck around for generations as the go-to solution for potential usurpers. A guy might try to seize the throne, get caught, and instead of getting executed, he'd wake up in a dark cell with no vision and zero chance of ever ruling again. Some emperors ordered it routinely. Basil II had his rival Bardas Scleros blinded, and Romanos IV Diogenes got the same treatment after losing the Battle of Manzikert. Outside Byzantium, blinding didn't vanish with time. In medieval Wales, the law literally mirrored the eye for an eye approach. If someone blinded another person, they could expect the same injury back. Wales wasn't the only place sticking to this logic. The Code of Hammurabi centuries earlier followed a similar principle, but medieval Wales enforced it in the flesh. No long trials, no abstract penalties, just someone showing up and making sure both parties matched. In Central Asia, Timur took the cruelty up a few notches. When his army captured enemy soldiers, he often blinded entire groups. Timur used them as warnings. During his military campaigns, especially across Persia and Mesopotamia, he sometimes blinded thousands of prisoners at once. In one case, after taking Aleppo in 1400s, sources report that he blinded around 4,000 men and sent them back to their city in groups, guided by a single one-eyed survivor per group. Captured soldiers weren't the only ones at risk. If a town resisted, their leaders might get the same treatment. If it surrendered late, the punishment might still come. Decimation. About as early as 5th century BC, the Roman military had this as punishment. It was around the time when the Roman Republic was still tightening its grip on power and figuring out how to keep soldiers in line. Roman commanders didn't mess around with long speeches or second chances when entire units lost discipline or fled the battlefield. Instead, they used decimation. That meant grabbing a whole unit, usually a cohort or a legion, that had either mutinied, deserted, or straight up embarrassed itself during a fight, and forcing it into a ritual of humiliation and violence. The name comes from the Latin decimatio, meaning removal of a tenth, and that's exactly what it was. The men were divided into groups of 10. Then each group had to draw lots. Whoever pulled the short straw got beaten or stoned to death by the other 9. No professional executioners, no clean kills. The other soldiers were forced to do it themselves, sometimes with clubs, sometimes with fists or stones, depending on what was on hand. The earliest record of this goes back to Roman commander Appius Claudius Sabinus Regilensis, who used it on his own troops after they retreated from battle. Decimation was organized, controlled, and deliberately public. Commanders gathered the entire legion to watch, just to make sure everyone saw what happened when discipline broke down. And it didn't matter how long someone had served, or whether they were personally innocent. Even the most loyal soldier in the 10-man group could be picked and killed by his friends. That was the point. Decimation didn't happen often. mostly because it wrecked morale, wasted manpower, and left survivors either traumatized or resentful. Still, when it did happen, it left a mark. One of the most infamous examples came during the Third Servile War, when Marcus Licinius Crassus used decimation on units that had fled from Spartacus and his army of rebel slaves. Crassus needed to fix a series of failures fast, and he knew that a brutal display could snap the army out of its panic. So he revived the practice, even though it had fallen out of use for decades. Somewhere between 500 and 1,000 men were killed during that round. Another case happened under Lucius Apronius in 20 AD when part of the Roman army failed in battle against North African rebels. Instead of just punishing the officers or frontline fighters, Apronius went full scorched earth on morale and ordered decimation on an entire cohort. There was also a rare version of the punishment where the 9 survivors were given barley instead of wheat, lost their tents, and had to sleep outside the camp walls, basically left to suffer like animals. But the worst part of decimation wasn't even the execution or the demotion. It was the fact that survivors had to keep serving, right next to the people who just helped kill their closest friends. No comfort, no breaks. Upright jerker. In the mid-19th century, American executioners came up with a mechanical solution they thought would refine hangings. It was called the upright jerker, and the idea was that instead of dropping someone down through a trapdoor to break their neck, the rope would yank them up fast and hard by using a pulley system attached to counterweights. The belief was that this motion would create a cleaner, more efficient break in the neck vertebrae, supposedly making executions quicker and less chaotic. What actually happened was a completely different story. The setup usually involved a wooden frame, some form of a sliding pulley, and a system of weights often hidden behind a curtain or platform. Once the lever was pulled, the counterweights would drop, dragging the person upward into the air in a violent motion meant to create enough force to sever the spinal cord or dislocate the neck. The machine saw use mainly in New York during the 1800s, particularly in places like the Auburn Prison and the Clinton Correctional Facility. The prison authorities believed this setup was more dignified than the traditional gallows, since it avoided the visible fall and sudden drop of a trapdoor execution. But the mechanism didn't always work the way they intended. In a lot of the executions, the rope yanked the person up all right, but not with enough power or speed to actually break anything critical. So instead of a fast death, the person would end up suspended mid-air, twitching and gasping for several minutes while slowly suffocating. This made everything longer, messier, and more disturbing to everyone watching, including the executioners themselves. In some cases, if the rope wasn't tied right or the weights weren't balanced properly, the condemned didn't even stay suspended and ended up crashing back down to the floor or platform, still alive, and in worse shape than before. One of the earliest recorded failures of this method was with a man named John Billings. He was executed using the upright jerker in the 1890s at Clinton Prison. The pulley system dragged him up into the air, but his neck didn't break. Instead, he hung there convulsing for almost 5 minutes before he stopped moving. Prison staff reportedly had to walk away from the scene because it went on too long and looked sloppy. This method continued to be used sporadically into the early 20th century, mostly by prison wardens who still believed mechanical consistency could replace the variable physics of a trapdoor drop. They thought it would eliminate the guesswork of calculating proper drop lengths, body weight ratios, and rope elasticity. In reality, they just swapped one unpredictable problem for another. Sawing. What could possibly be any more convenient than sawing? Actually, a lot. A rope is one of them. But many places on Earth wanted sawing, so sawing it is. Victims were tied up and cut apart while still alive, using a saw handled by 2 people or hoisted on a frame. The process depended on the method chosen. Some were sawed across the body horizontally, typically at the waist or chest. That method was often done with the victim upright or lying down. Others were sawed vertically. You can picture that one already without me describing it. One of the most repeated names in stories of sawing executions was Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, better known as Emperor Caligula. According to multiple Roman stories, Caligula had enemies tied up and sawed across the body as punishment for treason or personal insults. He reportedly chose the transverse method, meaning the saw passed through the abdomen or chest instead of going lengthwise. In another incident from the 17th century, Sultan Moulay Ismail of Morocco used the sawing method on 2 brothers accused of leading a rebellion against him. Both were reportedly strung upside down and sawed vertically from groin to head. Executions under Moulay Ismail were generally designed to be theatrical and send a warning to political enemies. So sawing was about using their death as a fear tactic. The execution was reportedly carried out in a public space with a crowd present, and the bodies were left visible afterward. Medieval European art also showed images of this punishment, often linked to saints or religious figures. In many of those images, the person was bound upside down and sawed down the middle while surrounded by onlookers or soldiers. Those artworks showed up in religious manuscripts and woodcuts, especially in depictions of martyrdom. Sometimes, the scene included the tools, the executioners, and even demons, depending on the tone of the story being told. Virgin's Kiss Pit. In medieval Baden-Baden, inside a remote castle rumored to sit along the edge of the Black Forest, lies the Virgin's Kiss Pit. This setup was specifically designed to appear like an act of mercy, but was actually a disguised execution trap. The condemned would be taken underground, into a chamber carved from stone, where the walls were damp and cold, and a faint torchlight flickered through iron sconces. At the far end of the chamber stood a statue of the Virgin Mary, carved with open arms and detailed with features meant to convey comfort and forgiveness. To a prisoner already broken down by torture, illness, or isolation, it was meant to look like salvation. The prisoner was usually led alone into the room, or lowered down via ropes. Once they hit the stone floor, there was only one thing in front of them, the statue, standing tall in stillness, with its hands extended, as if offering peace. The condemned were either instructed or simply assumed that kissing the Virgin's hands would mark their final confession or act of penance. What they didn't know was that the statue was connected to a hidden trigger. The outstretched hands were actually levers connected to a mechanism beneath the stone floor. When the prisoner touched or kissed the hands, the floor gave way underneath them almost instantly. The pit beneath was built as a long vertical shaft that went deep below the chamber and was lined with multiple rotating wooden wheels. Each wheel had spikes, blades, or sharpened metal shards driven into the edges, positioned in such a way that anything falling through the shaft would be struck again and again. The motion of the wheels kept turning, slicing, and ripping through anyone unfortunate enough to fall. The deeper the shaft went, the more wheels they encountered. By the time the prisoner hit the bottom, you know what he looked like. In some versions of the story, there was no retrieval. The shaft led to an even deeper section of the castle, where the remains either decomposed in a sealed chamber or were swept away by an underground stream. The wheel, this bad boy, was one of medieval Europe's more methodical ways to kill someone slowly. It was mostly used on murderers, highway robbers, and people the authorities wanted to turn into a very public lesson. The victim, after being sentenced, would be brought out to a public square or execution site and tied out flat, arms and legs spread apart. Depending on the setup, the condemned could be placed on a wooden platform, the bare ground, or fastened to a wooden cross laid flat. The person doing the job carried a cartwheel or an iron bar, which was used to smash each limb one at a time. In some regional versions, like the Germanic Radern, the broken limbs weren't left to dangle. Instead, the executioner would take the body and weave it through the spokes of a large wooden wheel. That wheel would then be raised upright and mounted on a pole for the public to see. The person was threaded through the openings, sometimes with extra rope or iron fastenings to keep them in place. In certain areas, the victim was lashed to the wheel itself before the beating began, and the blows were struck between the spokes. The main goal in all variations was to leave a visibly wrecked body on display and to drag the death out long enough that the warning lasted as long as possible, both physically and symbolically. Some were given a coup de grace to speed up death, but not guaranteed. There were recorded cases where people like Matthias Klostermeier, a Bavarian outlaw in the 1700s, were broken on the wheel without being granted a final strike. Matthias was kept alive on purpose, and his execution lasted for hours. In other examples, even when the bones were all smashed, the person could stay conscious, especially if the brain and spine hadn't been damaged. 9. Familial extermination. In ancient China, especially during the Qin and Ming dynasties, committing treason didn't stop at getting yourself killed. If someone was found guilty of plotting against the emperor or even accused of it, the punishment dragged in everyone they were related to by blood or marriage. The state would wipe out not just the person accused of treason, but also their entire extended family. Anyone remotely connected to the accused, whether they had any idea what was going on or not, got rounded up and executed. It was a legal method used to send a very loud message. That message was, "Don't mess with the emperor, or you'll take your whole bloodline down with you." It happened in multiple dynasties and was written directly into imperial law. A big example was during the Ming dynasty, after an attempted assassination of the emperor. Not only were the main conspirators executed, but over 10,000 people were rounded up and put to death just for being related to or having some kind of connection to the plotters. There was no trial for each individual. Once someone was linked to a traitor, that was enough. Emperors used this punishment like a nuclear option, turning one crime into a state-sponsored purge. It was designed to erase the possibility of revenge from surviving family members and to sever the bloodline entirely, so no future descendant could ever claim power, land, or title from the original offender. Thankfully, the laws today are more objective about the kind of punishment given to you if you did something against it. It's not automatically to the gallows, but still, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. See y'all.